There is a version of your financial life that makes perfect sense. Not the version where luck plays the deciding role. Not the version where the timing of your birth, or the city you grew up in, or the family you were raised in explains everything. Those things matter, yes, but they do not explain everything. They do not explain why two people raised in the same household, with the same starting point, can end up in completely different financial positions 20 years later. They do not explain why someone who earns a high income still feels behind. They do not explain why someone with a modest income manages to build something stable and lasting while someone else, earning twice as much, cannot seem to hold on to anything. Something else is happening, something quieter, something that operates underneath the surface of your daily decisions. This audiobook is about that something. It begins with a simple but uncomfortable idea. Your financial life is not random. It is not the product of chaos or coincidence. It is the product of rules. Rules that shape your decisions, your habits, your relationship with money, and ultimately your results. Most of these rules are invisible to you right now. You are following them, but you have never named them. You have never examined them. And because you have never examined them, they have been running your financial life in ways you have not chosen and may not even recognize. That is what we are going to change. Think about the last time you felt frustrated about money. Maybe it was a month where expenses seemed to appear from nowhere and your account was lower than you expected. Maybe it was the realization that despite working hard for years, the number in your savings account had barely moved. Maybe it was watching someone else, someone you know, someone who does not seem to work harder than you, build something that felt out of reach for you. In those moments, most people ask the wrong question. They ask, what went wrong? They look for the mistake, the bad investment, the unexpected expense, the unlucky break. And sometimes there is a mistake. Sometimes there is an unexpected expense. But if you are honest with yourself, you know it is not just that one thing. It never is. Because the thing that went wrong this month is connected to something that happened last month. And that is connected to a pattern from last year. And that pattern has been with you for longer than you probably want to admit. That pattern is not a flaw. It is a rule. A rule you have been following without realizing it. Here is the thing about rules. They do not care whether you understand them or not. Gravity does not ask for your permission before it pulls you down. A financial rule does not pause while you get familiar with it. It operates regardless of your awareness. The only difference awareness makes is whether the rule is working for you or against you. Right now, some rules are working against you. Not because you are careless or undisciplined or not smart enough, but because no one ever explained the rules to you clearly. No one sat you down and said, here is how money actually moves. Here is what controls financial outcomes at the most fundamental level. Here is the difference between people who feel in control and people who feel like passengers in their own financial life. This audiobook is that conversation. Over the course of what follows, you are going to be introduced to 8 rules. Not all at once. That would be the wrong approach. These rules are better understood when they arrive the way understanding usually arrives, gradually, through context, through recognition, through the slow feeling of something clicking into place. You may find yourself pausing at certain points because something connects with your own experience. That is the point. These rules are not abstract theories. They are descriptions of patterns that already exist in your life. The question is not whether these rules apply to you. They already do. The question is whether you can begin to see them. Because once you see them, something changes. Not overnight, not without effort, but something fundamental shifts when you move from being unaware of a rule to being aware of it. You start making decisions differently, not because you have more money or more time or a better strategy, but because you finally understand what was controlling the outcome all along. This is not a promise of wealth. This is something more useful than that. This is a guide to understanding the system you are already inside. If something in this audiobook connects with your own experience, feel free to share it in the comments. Sometimes putting it into words helps you understand it more clearly. I do read them. Chapter 1. Why most people feel out of control with money. Most people never feel fully in control of their money. Not because they are bad with numbers. Not because they are irresponsible or lazy or uninformed, but because they are trying to manage something they do not fully understand. And when you do not fully understand a system, the system tends to manage you. Think about the last time you sat down and tried to figure out where your money was going. For most people, this exercise produces a specific kind of discomfort. Not just the discomfort of seeing numbers you do not like, but the deeper discomfort of realizing that you cannot quite account for everything, that the math does not add up the way it should, that there is a gap between what you earn, what you think you spend, and what you actually have. That gap is not just a financial gap, it is a knowledge gap, and knowledge gaps in finance tend to grow. Here is why. Money moves constantly. It comes in through income, and it leaves through spending. And along the way it is affected by dozens of small decisions that you make so quickly and so automatically that you barely register them as decisions at all. The coffee, the extra item in the cart, the subscription you forgot about, the meal you bought because you did not plan ahead. Each of these feels insignificant in the moment, and individually, each of them is. But money does not accumulate or disappear in single events. It accumulates or disappears through patterns. And most people are not watching their patterns. They are watching individual transactions. This is one of the most important distinctions in all of personal finance. And it is one that almost never gets discussed clearly. The difference between watching transactions and watching patterns. When you watch transactions, you are always reacting. You see the number go down and you feel anxious. You see an unexpected expense and you feel stressed. You make a mental note to do better next month, and sometimes you do for a while, and then the pattern reasserts itself and things look familiar again. When you watch patterns, you are operating in a completely different mode. You are no longer surprised. You are not reacting to individual events. You are observing behavior across time, and behavior across time tells you something that individual transactions cannot. It tells you what rules you are actually following, as opposed to the rules you think you are following. Most people have a significant gap between those two things. They believe they are disciplined with money. They believe they are aware. They believe they make thoughtful decisions. And they are not lying. They genuinely believe this. But belief and reality can sit very far apart when it comes to financial behavior. This is not a character flaw. It is a feature of how human beings are wired. Your brain was not designed to manage modern financial complexity. This needs to be said clearly, because a lot of financial advice operates as though the problem is simply motivation or effort. As though if you just cared more, tried harder, wanted it badly enough, you would naturally develop financial discipline. But that is not how cognition works. The human brain evolved in environments where there was no concept of a mortgage, a retirement account, compound interest, or a 30-year financial plan. It evolved to solve immediate problems: hunger, safety, social connection. The future, as an abstract concept, was much less relevant than what was directly in front of you. That wiring has not changed. You still live in a body and a brain that is far more motivated by what is happening now than by what might happen in 10 or 20 years. You still feel the pull of immediate satisfaction more powerfully than the pull of deferred reward. You still process loss more intensely than gain, which causes you to make reactive decisions when you feel financially threatened. And you are still heavily influenced by what the people around you do with money, often without realizing it. These are not weaknesses to be ashamed of. They are forces to be understood, because when you understand them, You can work with them instead of against them. Here is something worth sitting with. The average person will earn a significant amount of money over the course of their working life. The exact number varies depending on where you live and what you do, but for most people, the number is substantial. Enough, in principle, to build financial stability. Enough to be meaningfully different at the end of it than at the beginning. And yet most people reach the later stages of their working life without financial stability, without savings that feel adequate, without the sense that money has accumulated the way it could have. Where does it all go? The short answer is that it goes toward maintaining a lifestyle, and lifestyle tends to expand to fill available income. This is not a choice exactly. It is a pattern. And it is a pattern governed by rules that most people have never examined. When you earn more, you tend to spend more. Not because you planned to. Not because you sat down and decided that your new, higher income should result in a proportionally higher spending level, but because the rules you are following automatically adjust your behavior when your circumstances change. A raise arrives and somehow, without deliberate intention, the monthly expenses rise to match it within a year or two, and you are no further ahead than you were before. This is not inevitable, but it feels inevitable when you do not understand what is driving it. The feeling of being out of control with money, for most people, is not caused by dramatic financial events. It is caused by the slow, invisible operation of patterns they have never named and rules they have never examined. The drama is just the moment the pattern becomes visible. The moment the account is empty. The moment the credit card statement arrives. The moment you realize that years have passed and the financial position you imagined for yourself has not materialized. The drama is just the pattern making noise. The actual problem is quieter and older and much more specific than it looks in those dramatic moments. And that is where we are going next. Chapter 2. Rules you follow without realizing. Every pattern of behavior is governed by a rule. This is not a philosophical statement. It is a practical observation. If you do the same thing in similar situations repeatedly over time, then something is guiding that behavior. You may call it habit. You may call it personality. You may say that is just how you are. But underneath every consistent pattern, there is a rule operating. Sometimes that rule was consciously chosen, but most of the time, particularly in the domain of money, the rule was absorbed. It arrived through experience, through observation, through the environment you grew up in, through the beliefs and behaviors of the people around you. It was never announced. It was simply learned. And once learned, it became automatic. Let us start with a common one. You walk past a store. You were not planning to go in. You were not thinking about buying anything. But something in the window catches your attention, and you go in, and you browse, and you end up buying something. Not because you needed it, not because you had planned for it, but because the impulse was there, and the availability was there, and in the moment, the small friction of resisting the impulse felt worse than the small pleasure of acting on it. That is a rule in action. It is a rule that says, when something appealing is available and I have the means to purchase it, I purchase it. You did not choose that rule consciously, but it has been operating in your financial life, probably for years. Now imagine that same rule playing out not once, but dozens of times across a month. Dozens of small moments where the impulse appears and the resistance is low and the purchase happens. None of them significant, all of them real, and at the end of that month, there is a gap between what you intended to spend and what you actually spent. That gap is the rule showing itself. Here is what makes financial rules particularly powerful and particularly difficult to change. They are invisible precisely when they are most active. The moment of decision is the moment of least self-awareness. You are not thinking, what rule am I following right now? You are thinking, I want this, or this seems like a good deal, or I deserve a treat. The rule is the background, the structure beneath the thought. and it is usually only visible in hindsight when you look at the result and notice a pattern. This is the first important shift in how you think about your financial life. Moving from looking at outcomes to looking at patterns. Moving from asking what happened to asking what keeps happening. Because your financial life is not a collection of isolated events. It is a system, and systems follow rules. Let us talk about one of those rules directly. The rule that governs the relationship between your income and your expectations. Most people have a deeply embedded belief that financial progress should feel like progress. That as income rises, comfort should rise. That working harder and earning more should translate into a noticeably better quality of life. This belief is not wrong, but it becomes a rule that operates against long-term financial accumulation when it is applied automatically and without limit. When you get a raise, the rule says, you now earn more, therefore you can now spend more. And you do. You upgrade something, maybe the apartment, maybe the car, maybe the way you eat or travel or socialize. Each upgrade feels appropriate. Each upgrade feels earned. And in a narrow sense it is. But the rule has a long-term cost that is not immediately visible. The cost is that you never create permanent distance between your income and your spending. You never allow the gap to widen. And that gap, the distance between what comes in and what goes out, is where financial stability is built. The rule of expanding expectations works against that gap. Every time income rises, expectations rise to match it, and the gap never grows. Understanding this rule does not mean refusing to enjoy your income. It means becoming aware of the automatic adjustment so that you can make a deliberate choice about how much to adjust and how much to protect. The rule only controls you when it is invisible. When you can see it, you can decide. There is another rule that runs even deeper, and it is connected to time, specifically to how you think about future you. Research on human behavior has consistently shown something both fascinating and frustrating. People treat their future selves more like strangers than like themselves. When you imagine yourself 10 years from now, the part of your brain that activates is closer to the part that activates when you imagine a stranger than the part that activates when you think about your current self. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological pattern, and it has enormous implications for financial behavior. If future you is essentially a stranger, then sacrificing present comfort for future you is not a personally motivated act. It is closer to an act of charity, and most people do not reliably make financial sacrifices for strangers. They make sacrifices for themselves. They make sacrifices for people they feel connected to. This rule, the disconnection from future self, is one of the primary drivers of under-saving. People know they should save. They agree intellectually that saving is important. But in the moment of decision, when the choice is between enjoying money now and giving it to a stranger in the future, present enjoyment usually wins. This does not make you irresponsible. It makes you human. But once you understand the rule, you can work with it rather than against it. You can close the psychological distance between present you and future you. You can practice thinking concretely about the future, not as an abstract number in an account, but as a specific version of yourself living a specific life. The more real future you becomes in your imagination, the more naturally you extend care toward them. There is a third rule that belongs in this section because it operates at the level of social behavior rather than individual behavior, and it may be the most underestimated force in personal finance. The people around you set your financial normal, not by telling you what to spend, not by instructing you in any way, but simply by being present and living a certain way. Human beings are social calibrators. We are wired to observe the behavior of those around us and adjust our own behavior to maintain social cohesion and belonging. In evolutionary terms, this made sense. Being out of step with your group had real costs. Social exclusion was not a minor inconvenience. It was dangerous. That wiring still operates. And in modern life, It shapes financial behavior in ways that are rarely acknowledged. If your social group eats at certain restaurants, drives certain cars, takes certain vacations, lives in certain neighborhoods, you feel pressure, mostly unconscious, to maintain a similar standard. Not because anyone is demanding this of you, but because the internal experience of financial misalignment from your social environment is genuinely uncomfortable. The rule at work here is, your spending adjusts to maintain social alignment. And because this rule operates at a mostly unconscious level, it tends to be extremely powerful. You are not sitting down and saying, "My friends have nicer cars, so I need a nicer car." You are just feeling vaguely dissatisfied with your current car in a way that did not exist before. You are just noticing that yours looks older, or smaller, or less impressive in the parking lot. The feeling arrives first. The justification comes later. And the decision to upgrade follows the feeling, not a deliberate financial analysis. This rule can consume enormous amounts of money over a lifetime, not through dramatic purchases, through the steady drift of standards, the quiet upward pressure of keeping pace with those around you. Seeing this rule clearly is uncomfortable, because it requires acknowledging that many of your financial decisions have been influenced by social forces you were not consciously aware of. But this discomfort is the beginning of something useful. Because once you see the rule, you can make a choice. You can decide which standards you want to adopt for reasons that are genuinely yours, and which ones you have simply absorbed from the environment around you. These three rules, the rule of expanding expectations, the disconnection from future self, and the social calibration of spending, are operating in the background of most people's financial lives. They are not the only rules, but they are among the most powerful and least examined. And they share something important. They all operate most effectively when they are invisible. Naming them does not neutralize them instantly, but it begins the process of putting you in a different relationship with them. A relationship where you are the observer rather than the subject, where you can see the pattern before you repeat it. That shift in position is more valuable than any specific financial tactic, and it leads directly into the rule we are going to explore next. Chapter 3. The Rule of Control. There is a word that appears constantly in conversations about personal finance, and it is almost always used in a way that misses the real point. That word is budget. When most people hear the word budget, they hear restriction. They hear a list of things they cannot do, a cap on enjoyment, a financial diet, and because diets tend to fail, and because restriction tends to generate resistance, the budget usually does not last long. It starts in a moment of motivation, often after a financial shock of some kind, a large credit card statement, a month that ended with nothing left, a moment of clarity about how far the reality is from the plan. And then a budget is made. Categories are defined. Limits are set. A commitment is made to track everything. And for a week or two, sometimes even a month, it holds. And then life happens, and the friction of constant tracking becomes too high, and the categories stop being filled in. And slowly the budget becomes something that used to exist, a relic of a previous attempt, and the financial pattern reasserts itself. This is not a failure of willpower. This is a misunderstanding of what control actually means in a financial context. Real control over your financial life does not look like restriction. It looks like awareness. It looks like the ability to see clearly what is happening with your money and to make intentional choices about where it goes. The distinction is critical. Restriction is about denial. Control is about direction. Restriction exhausts you. Control empowers you. And the rule of control is really about this. Money goes where you direct it. When you do not direct it, it drifts. And drift, compounded over months and years, produces results you did not choose. Let us think about what directing money actually requires. First, it requires knowing what is coming in. This sounds obvious, but for many people it is actually less clear than it seems. Income varies. Side work appears and disappears. Bonuses arrive unpredictably. Tax refunds distort certain months. Having a genuinely clear picture of average monthly income across a full year, if possible, is less common than people think. Second, it requires knowing what is actually going out. Not what you think is going out. Not what you would estimate if someone asked you. What is actually going out in real numbers, across real categories, over real time. And this requires tracking, not obsessively, not with a spreadsheet that takes 2 hours a week to maintain, but consistently and honestly, with enough detail to see the patterns. Most people, when they do this for the first time, are surprised. Not always by the big categories. You probably have a rough sense of what your rent or mortgage costs, what your groceries cost, what your regular bills amount to. The surprise usually comes from the small and medium categories. The dining out, the subscriptions, the convenience purchases, the small habits that individually seem trivial but collectively represent a significant portion of income. There is a specific kind of expense that appears in almost every honest financial review, and it might be called the invisible category. These are expenses that do not fit neatly into any mental category you maintain. They are the miscellaneous costs, the one-time purchases that recur more often than you realize, the small treats and conveniences that feel like exceptions but are actually a consistent pattern. When you look at a full year of spending, the invisible category is often one of the largest categories. And yet it is the category that people most consistently underestimate when they try to describe their spending. Seeing it clearly is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Because you cannot direct something you cannot see. The second component of the rule of control goes beyond awareness into allocation. Allocation is the act of deciding in advance where money goes rather than discovering, after the fact, where it went. This is the real power behind the concept of a budget, and the reason that budgeting, properly understood, does work even though most people's experience of it suggests otherwise. The difference is in the sequence. Most people budget by tracking what has already happened and trying to do better next time. The sequence is spend, observe, regret, resolve. This sequence keeps you permanently in a reactive relationship with money. Allocation reverses the sequence. The sequence becomes receive, direct, then live within what remains. Money is allocated before it is available to spend casually. The savings happen first. The investments happen first. The planned expenses are covered first. And what remains is what is available for everything else. This resequencing sounds simple. It is not always easy, but it is the structural change that separates people who are building financial stability from people who are perpetually hoping to save whatever is left over at the end of the month. What is left over at the end of the month is almost always less than expected, because spending expands to fill available income. This is not a criticism. It is a behavioral reality, and allocation is the practical response to that reality. You are probably already doing some version of allocation without naming it. If you have an employer pension, a portion of your income is allocated to retirement before you ever see it. If you have a standing order to a savings account on the day your income arrives, that is allocation. The question is whether the allocation is deliberate and sized correctly, or whether it is incidental and undersized. Let us talk about what the rule of control looks like in practice, because it is easy to describe in principle and harder to implement in reality. The first step is creating a genuinely accurate picture of your current financial reality. Not an idealized picture, not the version where you assume you spend less than you do. The real picture. Income, actual and average. Expenses, actual and complete. And the gap between them, if there is one, or the surplus, and how large it is. This picture might be uncomfortable to look at. Many people avoid it for exactly this reason, but the discomfort of seeing clearly is temporary. The cost of not seeing clearly is permanent. The second step is deciding with intention where that surplus goes. What percentage is allocated to savings? What percentage to investment? What percentage to debt reduction? What percentage to discretionary spending? These allocations do not have to be perfect on the first attempt. They need to exist. They need to be committed to, and they need to be reviewed. The third step is putting systems in place that make the allocations automatic rather than dependent on ongoing willpower. Automatic transfers, automated savings, standing orders. The reduction of the number of moments where you have to make an active choice about whether to direct money correctly. Because every time the choice is active, willpower is required. And willpower is a limited resource that tends to be low at exactly the moments when financial temptation is highest. The rule of control is not about becoming someone who does not enjoy money. It is not about eliminating spontaneity or pleasure from your financial life. It is about ensuring that the enjoyment you get from money is a result of intentional decisions rather than unconsidered drift. People who have genuinely internalized the rule of control often describe their relationship with money as calm. Not perfect, not unlimited, but calm, because they know where things stand. They know what is coming in and what is going out and what is being built. They can make a spontaneous decision to spend money on something enjoyable without anxiety, because they know the structure is intact. The enjoyment is real because it is chosen. That calmness is not the absence of financial challenge. Everyone faces financial challenges. It is the presence of clarity, and clarity is what control produces. The rule of control is one of the foundational rules of financial life because everything else depends on it. Saving requires it. Investing requires it. Debt management requires it. Every other financial behavior is harder and less effective without a baseline level of control over where money goes. But control, while necessary, is not sufficient. Because there is something that happens beyond control, something that requires a different kind of discipline, a different relationship with time, and a different relationship with desire, and that is where the next rule lies. Chapter 4. The rule of delayed reward here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. When did you last wait for something you wanted? Not because you had to. Not because the thing was unavailable, but because you made a conscious decision to delay getting something you could have had sooner in exchange for a better outcome later. For many people, this kind of waiting has become genuinely uncommon, not because they are impatient by nature, but because the modern environment has systematically reduced the necessity of waiting. You can buy almost anything instantly. You can access entertainment instantly. You can borrow money instantly. The friction between wanting something and having it has been reduced to almost nothing in most areas of modern life, and this convenience is real and valuable in many contexts. But in the context of financial life, it has a significant cost, because financial progress is built almost entirely on the ability to delay gratification, to accept less now in exchange for more later, to tolerate the discomfort of not having something you want today, because doing so creates conditions that lead to better things tomorrow. This is not a new idea. The psychological research on delayed gratification and its relationship to long-term outcomes has been accumulating for decades. The basic principle is not in dispute. What is less often discussed is why it is so difficult in practice, and what actually helps. Let us start with why it is difficult. The first reason is the one we touched on earlier. Future you feels like a stranger. When the reward is abstract and distant, the sacrifice required to achieve it feels like giving something real away to receive something imaginary. Present comfort is tangible. Future financial stability is a concept, and your emotional system is not naturally moved by concepts. It is moved by what feels real, immediate, and certain. The second reason is something researchers call hyperbolic discounting. This is the tendency, present in virtually all human beings, to value a reward more highly when it is available now than when it is available in the future, even when the future reward is objectively larger. Given a choice between $100 today and $110 in a month, Most people choose the immediate 100, and yet, mathematically, the choice makes no sense. A 10% return in a single month is extraordinary, but the pull of the present overwhelms the math. This discounting becomes less extreme as the delay becomes longer. People are better at comparing rewards that are both significantly in the future than rewards where one is immediate and one is delayed. But the critical financial decisions, the ones that happen every week and every month, tend to be exactly the ones where the choice is between now and later, and now wins far more often than it should. The third reason delayed gratification is difficult is that the relationship between sacrifice and reward is often opaque. When you exercise, you feel the discomfort immediately, but the physical change takes weeks or months to appear. The delay between effort and visible result is a significant contributor to dropout rates in exercise programs. The same dynamic applies to saving and investing. You feel the restriction of putting money away every month. The result, the financial position you are building, is invisible for a long time, and invisible results do not provide the kind of positive reinforcement that sustains behavior over time. This is why financial discipline tends to collapse in the middle. People start with motivation. They see the goal clearly. They make the sacrifices. And then, months in, the goal still feels distant, the sacrifices still feel real, and the motivation that launched the effort has faded. The middle of any long-term financial plan is the most fragile period. It is where most attempts fail. Not because the plan was wrong, because the feedback loop is too slow and too opaque to sustain the behavior. Understanding this does not solve the problem by itself, but it helps you anticipate it. And anticipating the difficulty is the beginning of navigating it. So what actually helps with the rule of delayed reward? The first thing is making the future more concrete and emotionally vivid. Not a number, a life. If you are saving for retirement, spend time thinking specifically about what you want that period of your life to look like. Where do you want to live? What do you want to do with your time? What kind of security do you want to have? What relationships do you want to be able to prioritize? The more specific and emotionally real this vision becomes, the less distant and abstract it feels. And the less distant it feels, the more motivated you are to make the sacrifices that lead toward it. This is not magical thinking. It is behavioral engineering. You are deliberately constructing a mental representation that gives your emotional system something real to be motivated by. The second thing that helps is reducing the number of moments where delayed gratification is required. This sounds paradoxical, but it is actually practical. Every time you have to actively resist spending money on something, you are using willpower, and willpower depletes. The solution is not to have more willpower. The solution is to design your financial environment so that fewer active choices are required. If money is automatically directed to savings before you ever have the opportunity to spend it, you do not have to exercise self-control every time income arrives. The decision has already been made. This is what behavioral economists call commitment devices. Mechanisms you put in place in advance that make the aligned choice the default, and the misaligned choice require more effort. The most powerful commitment devices in personal finance are automatic and invisible. They work while you are not thinking about them. They protect your long-term interests during the moments when your short-term preferences would otherwise win. The third thing that helps is changing your relationship with the waiting itself. There is a subtle but important distinction between patience and deprivation. Deprivation is a passive experience. It is the feeling of not having something you want, of being held back, of missing out. Patience is an active experience. It is the feeling of moving towards something, of choosing to wait because the outcome is worth it, of exercising capability rather than enduring limitation. The rule of delayed reward becomes much easier to follow when you are in a patient relationship with time rather than a deprived one. When you deposit money into savings, the framing matters. The framing of "I cannot spend this money" produces the experience of deprivation. The framing of "I am directing this money toward the life I am building" produces the experience of agency. The behavior is identical. The experience is completely different, and the experience determines whether the behavior is sustainable. There is a financial decision that crystallizes the rule of delayed reward more clearly than almost anything else. The decision about what to do with an increase in income. When income rises, whether through a raise, a bonus, a promotion, or a new income stream, a window of choice opens. For a brief period, the new income has not yet been absorbed into lifestyle. Expectations have not yet adjusted. The money is, in a sense, uncommitted. And in that window, the choice you make will have effects that compound over years. If you allow the new income to be absorbed by lifestyle inflation, the window closes and the income disappears into expanded spending. If you direct a meaningful portion of the new income towards savings or investment before it becomes part of your spending baseline, you have made a permanent improvement to your financial position. Not because the amount is enormous, but because it compounds, and because you have practiced the rule. The people who build wealth consistently over long periods are not necessarily the ones who earn the most. They are the ones who have learned, through practice and deliberate choice, to act on the rule of delayed reward at exactly these windows. When income rises, they let lifestyle rise modestly, and they direct the rest toward the future. When a windfall arrives, they make intentional allocations before the money has a chance to drift. They do not do this because they are naturally more disciplined. They do it because they have understood the rule and have built their behavior around it. Delayed reward is not about denying yourself. It is about understanding that your financial life operates on a timeline that extends far beyond today. That the decisions you make now are sending ripples forward in time, shaping what will be available to future you. And that the version of you who will live with those results 10 or 20 or 30 years from now is worth caring about. That version of you is not a stranger. That version of you is you. If you recognize yourself in parts of this, you are not alone. You can share your thoughts in the comments if you want to. Chapter 5. The Rule of Multiplication. There is a moment in every financial journey when the rules change. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, but quietly and with enormous significance. It is the moment when your money begins to make money. Not through your direct effort, not through more hours worked or more sales made or more value delivered, but through the mechanism of money placed in motion, in systems that generate returns, which generate more returns, which accumulate over time in a way that begins to feel, at first, almost imperceptible, and then, over longer periods, almost miraculous. This is the rule of multiplication, and it is the rule that most people understand least. Not because it is complicated. The basic concept is one that most adults have encountered at some point. Compound interest, returns on investment, the idea that money grows when it is placed in the right position. These are familiar concepts in theory, but there is a significant gap between knowing about compound growth and actually experiencing the behavior change that comes from deeply believing in it, from feeling it in your decisions, from understanding, not just intellectually but viscerally, what it means that money placed today will be worth many times more in the future if it is left undisturbed. Let us make this concrete. A sum of money, invested and growing at a reasonable return, does not simply double once and stop. It doubles, and then what it has become doubles again, and then that larger amount doubles again. The timeline for this feels frustratingly slow at the beginning because the amounts being multiplied are small and the doublings take years. But as the base grows, as the accumulated amount becomes larger, each doubling represents more absolute value than the previous one. The time required does not change, but the amount added increases with every cycle. This is what makes the rule of multiplication so powerful when understood early and so painful when understood late. The difference between starting at 25 and starting at 45 is not just 20 years. It is several doublings. It is the difference between having the early, slow phase of multiplication work in your favor and arriving late, after the compounding has already happened without you. But here is something important to say directly. Wherever you are in your financial journey, the rule of multiplication is still available to you. Its effects are greatest when started early. But the alternative to starting late is never starting, and never starting means never experiencing the rule at all. The most important moment to begin is not 10 years ago. It is now. So what does the rule of multiplication actually require in practice? The first requirement is commitment to placing money in motion. Money that sits in a low-yield account is not multiplying. It is, in real terms, shrinking, because inflation is slowly reducing its purchasing power. Money that is deployed into assets that generate returns, whether through investment in financial markets, real estate, ownership of businesses, or other productive use of capital, is multiplying. The specific vehicle matters less than the principle. Money must be placed in motion to multiply. This requires overcoming a specific kind of inertia that is extremely common. The feeling that you do not have enough to start, that the amount you could invest is too small to make a difference, that you should wait until you have more before you begin. This feeling is understandable and almost universally mistaken. The amount does not need to be large to begin the process of multiplication. What it needs to be is consistent. Regular, ongoing contributions to invested assets, even at small amounts, establish the habit, establish the behavior, and allow the compounding to begin. As income grows and more becomes available to invest, the habit is already in place. The behavior pattern is established, and the amounts can increase without the friction of starting something new. The second requirement of the rule of multiplication is patience of a specific kind. Not just the patience to delay gratification, though that is necessary, a deeper patience. The patience to leave money undisturbed during periods when its value falls, knowing that short-term losses are part of a longer-term process that has historically rewarded patience. Most people who invest discover this patience is harder to maintain than they expected. It is one thing to understand intellectually that markets fluctuate and that a downturn does not mean permanent loss. It is another thing to watch the value of your invested money decline and resist the urge to intervene. The pain of watching a loss in the present tends to be felt much more intensely than the pleasure of the gain that preceded it. And this asymmetry of feeling drives one of the most common and costly behaviors in investing: selling during downturns, locking in losses, and missing the recovery. This is the fear response operating in a domain where it causes financial harm. The same instinct that protects you from physical danger, remove yourself from the harmful situation immediately, actively destroys value when applied to long-term investments. Understanding this does not make the feeling disappear, but it gives you a framework for making decisions that are based on the logic of the rule rather than the emotion of the moment. The third requirement is reinvestment. Returns should not be consumed. They should be returned to the base so that they generate further returns. This is the mechanism of compounding. It requires a deliberate choice, particularly when returns arrive in a visible form, as dividends, as interest payments, as profitable sales. The temptation to consume these returns is real, but the rule of multiplication requires that they be fed back into the system. Over very long periods, reinvestment is responsible for the majority of total return, not the original investment, not even the ongoing contributions. The reinvested returns, generating their own returns, compounding forward through time. This is the mechanism that separates people who have invested for decades from people who have not. Not some special insight into which assets to choose, not extraordinary risk tolerance or unusual luck, but the patient, consistent practice of placing money in motion, leaving it undisturbed, and reinvesting what it produces. Now let us talk about leverage, because it belongs in any serious discussion of the rule of multiplication. Leverage is the use of borrowed money or other people's resources to increase the potential return on your own capital. In its most common form, it is a mortgage. You use borrowed money to purchase an asset worth many times what you could have purchased with only your own funds. As that asset appreciates, you benefit not just from the return on your own investment, but from the return on the total value of the asset. Your effective return on your own capital is multiplied. Leverage is one of the most powerful financial tools available. It is also one of the most dangerous, because it multiplies outcomes in both directions. The same mechanism that amplifies gains when an asset appreciates also amplifies losses when an asset declines. And unlike an unleveraged investment, where the worst case is the loss of your invested amount, a leveraged investment can result in losses that exceed your original investment. This is why leverage requires a different kind of risk awareness than unlevered investing. Not the vague awareness that something could go wrong, the specific understanding of exactly how much you can lose, under what conditions, and whether you can withstand that outcome if it occurs. People who use leverage well do not use it to increase the size of their bets. They use it to accelerate a financial process that they understand and that they have strong reason to believe in, at a scale that they can manage if conditions turn adverse. The rule of multiplication, at its core, is about understanding the relationship between capital, time, and returns. It is about recognizing that money is not just a medium of exchange. It is a resource that can be deployed, that can work, that can generate returns while you are not actively involved. Most people's relationship with money is primarily as earners and spenders. The rule of multiplication invites a third relationship, owner, not just of things, but of productive assets, things that generate value over time. This shift in perspective from earner and spender to owner is one of the most significant transitions in financial thinking that a person can make. Because once you see yourself as an owner of productive assets, your decisions about how to use income change. Spending becomes one option among several. Investment becomes a natural allocation rather than a sacrifice. The rule of multiplication does not require wealth to begin. It requires the decision to begin. Chapter 6. The rule of consistency. Everything we have discussed so far, the control, the patience, the multiplication, depends on one thing more than any other. It depends on doing it again tomorrow. This is the rule of consistency, and in many ways it is the rule that holds all the others together. Because rules that are applied once, or applied enthusiastically for a month and then abandoned, are not really rules. They are experiments, and experiments do not compound. They do not build momentum. They do not create the kind of structural change in your financial life that makes the difference visible over years and decades. Consistency is the mechanism through which financial decisions become financial reality. Let us be specific about what consistency is not. Consistency is not perfection. This distinction is critical because many people abandon financial habits at the first imperfect month. They set a savings target, they miss it 1 month, and the miss becomes the narrative. I failed, I cannot do this. And the habit dissolves, not because of the miss, but because of the story attached to the miss. The story that a single imperfect month represents evidence of permanent inability. This story is false, and it is expensive. A missed month in a savings plan is not a failure. It is data. It tells you something about the conditions under which your financial behavior becomes harder to maintain. It tells you something about where the friction is, and that information, used properly, makes the plan more robust rather than invalidating it. The question after a difficult month is not, did I fail? The question is, what made this month harder, and what can I change to make next month easier? Consistency is also not uniformity. Financial life is not static. Income fluctuates, expenses vary, life circumstances change. The version of consistent behavior that is appropriate for a high-income month looks different from the version that is appropriate for a low-income month. Rigidly applying the same rules regardless of changed circumstances is not consistency. It is inflexibility, and inflexibility tends to break where a more adaptive approach would bend and hold. Real consistency is about direction, not about precise repetition. It is the sustained orientation toward a financial goal, maintained across changing conditions, expressed through behavior that adapts its form while holding its intention. Now let us talk about why consistency is so difficult to maintain over long periods, because it is worth understanding rather than simply asserting that it requires discipline. The primary enemy of consistency is what might be called motivation dependency. Most financial plans are launched during periods of high motivation. The decision to change financial behavior is usually triggered by a significant event. A financial shock, a wake-up call, a moment of genuine clarity about the gap between current situation and desired outcome. In that moment, motivation is high. The plan feels sustainable. The sacrifices feel manageable. The future feels real and achievable. But motivation is not a stable state. It ebbs and flows. It is high when things are fresh and low when they are routine. It is high when you remember why you started and low when the goal feels distant. And in the absence of high motivation, behavior that depends on motivation tends to drift. This is the design flaw in motivation-based financial plans. They work well when motivation is high and poorly when it is not, and motivation is not reliably high enough often enough to sustain a plan that runs for years or decades. The solution is not to maintain artificially high motivation. That is not realistic. The solution is to design financial behavior that does not require high motivation to execute. That is the structural response to the problem of motivation dependency. What does this look like in practice? It looks like automatic systems, transfers that happen on a scheduled basis without requiring a decision, investment contributions that are set and left in place, debt repayments that come out before the rest of the month's decisions are made. The goal is to reduce the number of moments where motivation is required as a precondition for aligned financial behavior. This is not a new idea. It is the same principle behind automatic pension contributions, behind employer-matched savings programs, behind every system that makes the financially aligned choice the default. The insight is that human motivation is unreliable, but systems are not. If the system is well designed, it operates whether motivation is high or low. But systems alone are not the complete answer, because systems need maintenance. They need periodic review. They need adjustment as circumstances change. And this review and adjustment process does require motivation, not in the intense burst that launches a new plan, but in the steady, low-level form of continued attention and engagement with your financial life. This is the version of motivation that sustains consistency, not the surge of inspiration that begins something new. The quieter, more durable commitment to continuing to pay attention, to reviewing your financial picture regularly, to adjusting allocations as income changes, to noticing when a system is no longer serving its purpose and updating it. Think about the difference between someone who makes a financial plan once and executes it for years without review, and someone who makes a financial plan, reviews it quarterly, and makes adjustments based on what has changed. The second person is not working harder, but they are engaging with their financial life more continuously, and continuous engagement prevents the slow drift that occurs when attention lapses. There is a specific kind of momentum that builds through financial consistency, and it is worth describing because it is one of the most motivating realities in personal finance once you have experienced it. When you follow a financial plan consistently for a significant period, something changes in how you experience financial decisions. The initial phase is hard. The sacrifices feel new, and the results are not yet visible. But as months become years, and as the results begin to appear in the form of growing savings, reduced debt, or increasing investment values, the relationship between behavior and outcome becomes more visceral. You begin to believe in the process in a way that is different from intellectual agreement. You have felt it work, and that experiential belief is far more durable as a motivator than any initial inspiration. This is why people who have maintained financial discipline for a long time often describe it as feeling natural rather than effortful, not because they have more willpower, but because the feedback loop has closed. The results are visible enough and real enough that the behavior sustains itself. The consistency has become identity. Which brings us to the next rule, Chapter 7. The rule of identity. You have a financial identity. You may not have thought about it in those terms, but it exists. It is the set of beliefs you hold about yourself in relation to money. Who you are with money. What kind of person you naturally are when it comes to financial decisions. Whether you see yourself as someone who is good with money or someone who struggles. Whether you see yourself as a saver or a spender. Whether you see money as something you understand or something that has always confused and eluded you. These beliefs are not just descriptions of your behavior. They are prescriptions for it. This is the rule of identity. Your behavior with money follows your beliefs about who you are with money, not your intentions, not your plans, your identity. What you believe at a fundamental level about what kind of person you are. This is why financial change that is purely behavioral, that focuses only on what you do with money without examining what you believe about yourself in relation to money, tends to produce temporary results. You can follow a budget for a month. You can save consistently for a quarter. You can make excellent financial decisions for a period of time. But if your underlying identity remains that of someone who is not good with money, who always spends more than they should, who is not the kind of person who builds wealth, then the behavior will eventually return to match the identity. Because identity is more stable than intention, this is not a pessimistic observation. It is actually an empowering one, because it locates the lever of lasting financial change not in the behavior, not in the tactics, but in something deeper and more fundamental, the beliefs you hold about yourself. Let us look at where financial identity comes from. A significant portion of financial identity is formed in childhood, through observation of how money was handled in your household, the specific messages you received, spoken and unspoken, about what money means, what rich people are like, whether wealth is attainable for people like your family, whether discussing money is appropriate or shameful, whether financial success is a realistic aspiration or an irrelevant fantasy. These messages settle into beliefs that feel like personal truth rather than absorbed perspective. They feel like you rather than like something that happened to you, and they operate accordingly. If you grew up in a household where money was always tight, where financial stress was a constant presence, where any surplus was consumed immediately because experience had taught that surpluses do not last, you may have absorbed a specific set of beliefs. That there is never enough. That saving is futile because something always takes it away. That financial stress is simply the condition of your life. These beliefs are not stupidity. They are adaptations to a real environment. They were sensible in context. But they may be operating in your current life in ways that no longer serve you. If you grew up in a household where spending was a primary form of expression, where possessions were status, where lifestyle was constantly expanding, you may have absorbed different beliefs. That spending is how you show that things are going well. That financial restraint is something to be embarrassed about, that the measure of success is visible in what you own and where you live. Neither of these examples represents a defective upbringing. They represent real environments with real logics. But the beliefs that were appropriate in those environments may be creating financial outcomes in your adult life that you would not choose if you could see the mechanism clearly. The rule of identity operates most powerfully in moments of financial decision-making. Not in the abstract, not in the planning session where you have time to think carefully, but in the moment when money arrives, the moment when an opportunity to spend presents itself, the moment when a financial decision needs to be made quickly. In those moments, it is not your plan that governs your behavior. It is your identity. What feels natural? What feels like what someone like you would do? This is why identity change is so powerful and so underutilized in financial development. When you change what you believe about the kind of person you are with money, the behavior changes follow more naturally than they do when behavior is the primary target. Not immediately, not without friction, but with a quality of naturalness that makes the change more durable. So how does financial identity change? The first mechanism is evidence accumulation. Identity is based partly on what you believe about yourself, but also on what you have seen yourself do. When you make a financial decision that is aligned with the identity you want to have, that decision is a small piece of evidence. A single piece of evidence does not change identity, but accumulated evidence, many decisions over time, each one consistent with the person you are choosing to be, gradually updates the identity. You begin to have real examples of yourself behaving in financially aligned ways, and these examples are more persuasive than abstract beliefs. This is why the first financial discipline, no matter how small, matters so much, not because the amount is significant, but because it is evidence. It is the beginning of a different story about who you are with money, and stories accumulate. The second mechanism is language. The way you talk about yourself and money shapes the beliefs you hold about that relationship. There is a significant difference between saying, "I am not good with money," which is an identity statement, and saying, "I am learning to be better with money," which is a process statement. One closes a door, the other opens one. One describes a fixed truth, the other describes an ongoing trajectory. This is not about positive affirmations or denial of difficulty. If your financial behavior has been inconsistent or harmful, acknowledging that honestly is necessary. But the framing matters, not as self-deception, but as genuine recognition that identity is not fixed. That who you have been with money is not necessarily who you will be. The third mechanism is environment. Identity does not operate in a vacuum. It is maintained and reinforced by the environment around you. The people you spend time with, the communities you belong to, the media you consume, the conversations you have about money all contribute to the beliefs you hold about what is normal, what is possible, and what kind of person you are. If your environment consistently reinforces a financial identity that does not serve you, changing your behavior while remaining in that environment requires sustained resistance to cultural pressure. This is possible, but it is difficult, and it is not always necessary. Sometimes changing the environment is easier than resisting it. This might mean spending less time with people whose financial behaviors and attitudes are actively misaligned with where you are trying to go. It might mean consuming different media, reading different perspectives, joining communities of people who take financial growth seriously. It might mean having different conversations, ones that reflect a different set of possibilities. None of this requires rejecting people you care about. It requires being conscious about influence, because influence is happening whether you are conscious of it or not. There is something else that belongs in a discussion of financial identity, and it is the relationship between financial identity and self-worth. For many people, financial identity is entangled with overall self-worth in ways that make financial difficulty particularly painful and financial decision-making particularly fraught. When financial status feels like a measure of personal value, financial setbacks are experienced as indictments of the person rather than as events in a system. And when financial decisions feel like statements about who you are rather than practical choices, they carry an emotional weight that distorts them. Untangling financial identity from self-worth is not simple, but it is important, because the most grounded and effective financial decision Makers are not the ones who have made money their primary source of identity and self-worth. They are the ones who relate to money as a practical tool, who can make financial decisions from a place of clarity rather than anxiety, who can absorb a financial setback without it destabilizing their sense of who they are. This does not mean being indifferent to financial outcomes. It means placing those outcomes in a context that does not make them personal verdicts. You are not your financial position, but your financial position is, in large part, a product of your financial identity, and your financial identity is something you can examine, understand, and consciously reshape. That reshaping is the deepest form of financial work. It is also the most durable, because unlike a budget or a savings plan, which can be abandoned when motivation fades, identity is always present. It operates in every financial moment, in every decision, in every reaction. When your identity aligns with where you want your financial life to go, the rules stop feeling like constraints and start feeling like expressions of who you are. That is when the change becomes permanent. You began this audiobook at a certain point in your relationship with money. Maybe you began it with a specific question. Why does my financial situation look the way it does despite my efforts? Maybe you began it with a vague dissatisfaction, the sense that something should be different, but you could not quite name what. Maybe you began it with genuine curiosity, the feeling that there is more to understand about how money works in your life than you currently understand. Wherever you began, you have traveled through a particular kind of territory. You have moved through the recognition that financial outcomes are not random, that they are produced by patterns, that patterns are governed by rules, and that most people spend their entire financial lives following rules they have never examined, producing results they have never fully chosen. You have seen how unconscious financial behavior, the spending that happens without tracking, the saving that never quite happens, the investment that is always deferred, is not a character flaw. It is a predictable consequence of operating without awareness, of following invisible rules. You have been introduced to the rule of control and the distinction between restriction and direction, between managing your money reactively and allocating it intentionally, between discovering at the end of the month where money went and deciding at the beginning of the month where it will go. You have explored the rule of delayed reward, the science behind why waiting is difficult, the mechanisms that make waiting possible, and the fundamental reorientation that occurs when you begin to see future you as genuinely yourself rather than as an abstract stranger. You have understood the rule of multiplication, what it means for money to be in motion rather than static, the difference between consuming returns and reinvesting them, the compounding that becomes the most significant element of long-term financial outcomes when it is given time and consistency to operate. You have encountered the rule of consistency, the difference between motivation and systems, the importance of continuing when motivation is low, the momentum that builds over time when behavior aligns with direction, month after month, year after year. And you have sat with the rule of identity, the deepest and most durable rule of all, the recognition that who you believe yourself to be with money shapes every financial decision, and that reshaping that identity is the most fundamental work available to you. These rules do not operate in isolation. They form a system, and like all systems, they are interconnected. Control supports delayed reward. Delayed reward enables multiplication. Multiplication becomes meaningful through consistency, and consistency over time reshapes identity. Each rule strengthens the others. Each shift in awareness opens the next one. But here is what matters most, and it is worth saying clearly as we arrive at the end. Understanding rules is not the same as following them. This audiobook has offered you a framework, a way of seeing your financial life that is organized and, hopefully, clarifying. But a framework in your mind and a change in your behavior are two different things. The distance between them is the territory where most financial advice fails, because the knowing is much easier than the doing, and the doing, sustained over time, is where the outcomes lie. What matters now is not that you remember every concept from this audiobook. What matters is that one or two things have connected, that there is at least one pattern you can now see that you could not clearly see before, that there is at least one rule you have recognized as operating in your own financial life. Because recognition is the beginning of choice, and choice, applied consistently, is the beginning of change. You do not need to overhaul everything at once. The most durable financial change happens incrementally, one habit at a time, one system at a time, one belief examined, tested, and if it no longer serves you, replaced. The ambition for rapid transformation is understandable, but the practice of consistent incremental improvement is what actually changes lives. Start where you are, not where you think you should be, not where someone else's timeline suggests you should be by now, where you actually are, with what you actually earn, what you actually spend, what you actually believe about yourself and money. Because genuine progress begins in genuine reality, not in an idealized version of it. The rules were always there. They were operating in your financial life before you had names for them, before you had a framework to see them. They have been shaping your outcomes, your patterns, your results, quietly and consistently, whether you were aware of them or not. The difference now is that you can see them. And here is the thing about rules, the thing that is easy to miss when you are in the middle of feeling controlled by them. Rules can change, not overnight, not without sustained effort and honest self-examination. But rules are not permanent. The ones you have been following are not the only ones available to you. They are the ones you have been following, and you are not obligated to continue following rules that are not producing the life you want. The process of changing financial rules begins with seeing them clearly, with naming them honestly, with understanding what they have been producing and what they could produce if they were different. That process has begun. What comes next depends not on the rules themselves, but on what you choose to do with what you now understand. Your financial life is not controlled by luck. It never was. It is controlled by rules you either understand or unknowingly follow. You have spent this time understanding them. Now, slowly, patiently, and with the clarity that only awareness can provide, you can begin to choose them.